Get into your car and you drive. It's actually our preferred way of travel. No destination in mind, just letting the trip unfold or unravel as it is as you go along. Getting off the main highways and taking those roads less traveled that kind of are intriguing, that take you through, the small towns of where real people live. You get away from the tourist traps and all those sorts of things. You stop to shoot a game of pool in a tavern along the way. You stop at mom and pop cafes for food. It's the best, like it's home cooked meals. You stop wherever you feel like for the night, and you just kind of stay there and then pick up your journey the next day. You simply enjoy the process of the journey. The lyrics of the song actually describe what kind of appeals to me most about some of these road chases. He talks about going places where that I've never been and seeing things that I may never see again. Kind of brings back some memories of a road trip I took when I was about 22 years old. I know it's a long time, but it was a bit over 50 years ago now. But put a backpack on and I kind of hit the road and went down through Mexico and Central America into Colombia, Ecuador, Venezuela. Ended up spending a couple months living on the beach in the little island of Tobago. And every day was a new adventure. It was an exciting time to be out there along the way. I also think that as we talk about what it means to follow Jesus, there's something to be said about this as well. When we follow Jesus, he takes us to places where we've never been. We often see and experience things that we've never experienced and probably won't experience again, because every day is often a new adventure as we're on the road with Jesus. It's the greatest and most exciting place to be. I know some of you like to have your life planned out and kind of live your plan. Life, I say, is what happens while you're making other plans. I think that's what I've discovered. When I make other plans, I discover rarely do my plans work out, so I just don't bother with that, and I just let things happen. Little aside, opposites attract. I married somebody who likes to have order in her life and kind of have everything planned out, and so it's been a challenge for her. We've been married now for 51 years, and she's still with me. So somehow she's stuck it out. She's full of grace and mercy and forgiveness along the way. Little side story. I can remember one place where we were traveling along, and I said, "Yeah, we'll get over to I-5. We're coming across and heading west, and there's going to be a lot of places to stay when we get to I-5." It was a weekend in August. It was an August-long weekend, I think, in the States as well. And guess what? We got there, and there were lineups out of every single last motel. And I was thinking, I think we're going to be sleeping in the car tonight. We had 2 kids with us. Anyway, we did end up finding a place to stay. I think we had to evict the cockroaches and the rats before we could lay down for the night, but it worked out, and we survived. Well, we've been on our journey with Jesus here through a various sermon series since the beginning of the year, just looking particularly at what it means to step out in faith, which is our theme for our English ministries for this year. We've looked at what it takes to forge a real world faith, one that works in the real world, one that when we step out in faith, it actually works when we get away from the comfortableness and the safety and security of our homes and our churches. What does it mean to develop this faith that works in the real world? And then taking the road less traveled, following Jesus as the way. Jesus said, "I am the way." And it's not only the path, but he's the way to live. There's so much more that we looked at that is wrapped up in that. Now, staying with the theme and the metaphor of being on the journey, we've kind of gone off on the road less traveled, but today we want to take up something else. We're going to start a new sermon series that we're going to go through along the way, listening to some stories that Jesus told as he traveled together with his disciples on the road. Storytelling and listening to those stories. One of the things that we like when we get into our car and travel is we like to plug in a CD. Some of you remember what CDs are? A great Canadian storyteller. If you've never heard of him, Google him, go on YouTube, you can find him. Stuart McLean. Appeared on CBC for years on something called the Vinyl Cafe. Fantastic storyteller. And it's a great way to pass the miles and listen to stories along the way. We would plug those in. Well, Jesus was a master storyteller. And perhaps it was his preferred method of teaching and the way of explaining to his disciples and others who cared to find out what his mission was really all about. Namely, what he had come and what he referred to as the kingdom of God. His storytelling was often somewhat subtle, had a lot of subtlety to it, and even a bit subversive at times. It was a way of getting a point across, sometimes without the person necessarily being aware of it until it had made its point. His stories always invited the hearer to enter into the story, to connect with the story in a very personal way, to find their place in the story, and in so doing to discover how the truth of what he was telling them and talking about applied to their lives as well. Storytelling was once a very significant means of communication in our world. It was a way of passing down family history. It was a way of teaching valuable life principles. It was a way of preserving and maintaining meaningful cultural and religious traditions. But it was not only a way of sharing knowledge and experiences, but a significant way of building community and maintaining connections and fostering relationships. It was a practice that fostered trust and cooperation and developed a sense of togetherness. Sadly, it seems to be increasingly a lost art. I think in large part due to our increased pace of life. We simply don't have that space in our lives or make that space or find the space where we can even sit down and spend time and share in each other's lives and tell each other the stories of our lives. We've lost those extended times as families when we would sit together at the end of the day. There's nothing else there, no other distractions, and to be able to recount what has happened during the day and talk about. We live in a time when people scroll through 1-minute videos while playing video games and chatting with somebody else on social media. We have so many distractions that keep us from actually finding the time to build into the art of storytelling once again. But it is an art that is worth reviving and bringing back. And if you are a family, I would challenge you to consider how you could do something like that or find occasions to do that. It's a way to strengthen our relationships in our communities. It's a way to foster development of creative imagination, preserve the essence of what it means to be human and family. My family is going to get together next Saturday, as we do about 2 or 3 times in a year. And inevitably, at some place in there, we recount stories out of our past, tell stories of our parents' life. And it's a way that we pass on the history of our family, and we preserve that sense that we are a family that has more than just today along the way. But we don't often realize is that there's something more to the effect of telling stories than we often realize. In fact, there's a very magical effect of storytelling and listening to stories that has as much to do with our biology as it has to do with our imagination. Research has shown it to be deeply connected with some neurological functions in our brain, within the human brain. Now, I'll resist going off into kind of a science lesson here, and because it's very fascinating. I get, as I kind of study these things, I end up spending more hours than I should kind of researching this, because it's so fascinating how we are created and how our body functions, and some of the things that we attribute a lot of value to, that we had kind of emotional and psychological value to, we don't always realize that there's a physical side to it that increases that value. Well, here's what happens when we hear a story. First of all, we hear a story, there's something called a neural coupling process that takes place. It's connecting us with the storyteller, creating a deeper sense of community or identification and empathy with that person, and with what character the story is possibly being told about in the story of themselves. We feel in many ways like we are experiencing what they are experiencing in a very real way as they tell the story. While stories also engage our emotions, and when we hear emotionally charged stories, our brains release oxytocin, often called the love hormone. It's the chemical released when we feel empathy or compassion. and cause us to connect with another person, and it plays a significant role in forming social bonds within a community, within a family. Well, our brains also release something that we know as dopamine. Dopamine, when we hear an engaging story, dopamine is a neurotransmitter that's associated with pleasure and with joy. It's actually one of those causes of, kind of brings on addiction when somebody experiences that pleasure or joy through substance abuse, for instance. And because you experience that so much pleasure out of that you keep chasing after that. But there's positive ways to experience that same thing, and telling stories and listening to stories actually creates that same feeling of joy and satisfaction in the process and makes the story more memorable. It is why we remember stories and things that are taught to us through stories more than we would ever remember any lecture. Listen, I'm a realist. I know I stand up here every Sunday morning, I talk to you, and research shows that by Wednesday you've forgotten everything I said. If I could become a better storyteller, you might remember it till Thursday or Friday. So I got to work on that. There's one more interesting effect of storytelling that our brain is something called mirror neurons. Special cells that are activated when we observe others performing something that we've experienced too, that we can relate to. Somebody tells us of being reunited with somebody who they've been separated for years, and they talk about that, meeting them at the airport and giving that warm embrace. And we experience that too. We begin to feel the same thing even as they tell that story. You know, if you happen to be at the airport and you watch people connect, you can almost feel the same thing as you see them embrace and greet each other as long-lost friends and family members. And so we can feel the same embrace that they're engaging in as they hug each other. All that to say, we really need to revive and reclaim the art of storytelling. Jesus taught, yes, in the temple courts and the synagogues, but he spent most of his time with everyday people going about their everyday lives, and he spoke to them not in the formal language of the religious formality or of that of a teacher or a rabbi, but in the conversational form of the language of everyday, of the street language. I grew up on the streets of Ecuador, Guayaquil, and when I first had the opportunity to speak in Spanish in a church, I realized I didn't know how to preach in Spanish, because my language that I learned, that I could practice, was street Spanish, and I had to relearn that. Well, Jesus spoke street language and spoke to the ordinary person in language that they understand. Something I think at times we need to learn here as well when we learn to share our faith, because we can often speak in words in a language that is incomprehensible to somebody who doesn't have a church or a Bible background. It's sharing stories in everyday language that they understand. And he would use this through stories, the stories that he would tell. And what better way to listen, to learn about Jesus than to learn his stories? Carl Medeiros, who's had a significant ministry or has a significant ministry among Muslims, advocates learning the parables, learning the stories that Jesus told, learning them well enough and keeping them understandable, so in a conversation that you're having with somebody else, if all of a sudden a story comes to mind, you can say, this reminds me of a story that Jesus told. And you simply bring up something in a very everyday kind of casual kind of way about a truth about Jesus. So the sermon series that we're going to be starting today, we're going to, over the next a couple of months or so, we're going to be looking at 11 of those stories that Jesus told. And hopefully you will be able to learn them in such a way that you could bring them up in a conversation that you're having with someone at some time. But today I just want to set the context in Luke's gospel where we find these stories. A lot of them are unique to Luke. Now the scripture read for us earlier marks a turning point in Luke's gospel account of the life and ministry of Jesus. He says, at that time, as the time approached for him to be taken up to heaven, that is, his time on earth is going to be done, Jesus sets out resolutely for Jerusalem. Now, up at this point in Luke's gospel, his first 9 chapters have focused on Jesus' ministry in the area that he was native to, Galilee, Nazareth, that area. He spent a lot of time there going around and drawing disciples. Actually, he would have been looked at as being a revolutionary leader, as somebody who was raising troops to, or getting followers to be able to go and take on the Romans. That's what his disciples thought he was, no doubt. They were loyal to him because they thought he was the Messiah that was going to lead them to be free from Roman rule. So at this point, he spent all his time in Galilee. He's been going about the region getting disciples. Galilee is to the north, and that's kind of the region where he is. And now he's going to head for Jerusalem. In the last little while, he's begun to teach his disciples, tell them about what awaits him when he arrives in Jerusalem, that he's going to be falsely accused, that by the religious, that he's going to suffer and eventually die. But that would not be the end of the story. All of that just did not fit with their perspective of who he should be as their Messiah, as their leader. Their understanding of him was totally different from anything that he was saying, and they could not quite absorb what he was saying. It was something they simply could not grasp, much less accept. But for Jesus, now the time had come to actually make his way for Jerusalem, for the inevitable end that awaited him there. And so with great determination, he sets out to head that way. Now what follows in Luke's account is sometimes referred to the travel narrative. It's about 10 chapters from chapter 9 to about chapter 19, where he's on the road. It involves traveling together, but there is no clear itinerary nor chronology for the trip. What there is a series of stories that Jesus tells as he's journeying with his disciples to prepare them for their lives beyond this time and to call others to a commitment to live out of a different perspective than the one they had. See, God was doing something new, and the invitation was there for them to join Jesus in that. But it would call for an unconditional commitment to him and his mission. Much as he says he sets out resolutely to set out for Jerusalem, he was demanding and requiring the same resolution from them. The stories that he told were a big part of teaching them and preparing them for that life that was lying ahead to them, what they needed to be ready to do. Now, he doesn't speak in a way that raises alarm or fear or even invites purely an emotional response, but rather in a conversational way that invites them to think deeper and weigh the cost of their response to his invitation. Discipleship on the road is very different than the way we do discipleship in the church, isn't it? We have kind of made discipleship into a program, and it was never meant to be that way. It was meant to be a relationship among people. Discipleship is meant to be something that happens and we experience on an ordinary, everyday basis, as opposed to sitting down in a classroom or even in a small group. I value small group meetings, okay? I'm not against them. They're valuable. But true discipleship, learning from each other, takes place as we do life together, as we spend time in our everyday lives together. Evangelism, discipleship are something that should be a normal process of sharing our life with others and with each other. I like what Paul writes when he writes to the Thessalonians, and he says, "We loved you so much that we delighted not only to share with you the gospel, but our very lives." That tells me something. Paul cared about people, that he spent time, they did life together. And as they did life together, he was able to share in a casual and ongoing conversational way his faith in Jesus and what that meant to him. Well, there's a kind of intimacy that develops and grows when people travel together. They spend kind of extended time together, and there's new relationships formed, deeper relationships formed as they go together and experience new things together in new places. That is something what we experienced as we went to Casa Luz last year. And I'm hoping for the same thing for the team that goes this year as we venture back out there with about half from last year's team, but also from also some new people coming along. We spent time at the end of the day gathering around a campfire and sharing each other's lives. What was your spiritual story? What was your story? And we bonded together in ways that we didn't know each other. We got to know each other in ways, in deeper ways than we had ever thought of before. For the disciples and Jesus, I can imagine their conversations as they walked along the road. And then perhaps at the end of the day, as they gathered around a campfire, at the end of the day, or were eating a meal in someone's home, through the hospitality that was offered, that was so much part of their culture. In those quieter moments, there was time to ask questions and ponder the answers that were given in a way that they would not always had to if they were always on the go. Sometimes we need to just slow life down, because when we live life at such a pace, we don't have time to ponder those things, to even build into each other's lives, to hear each other's stories, and to learn from each other that way. And so they were on this road trip with Jesus, but without fully comprehending all that is taking place and will take place. So this section of Luke 9:51 to 62, these verses that were read today, in many ways, they're a transition stage, a transition passage, that text that is going to take us into the chapters ahead. Now, to start out with, they were entering Samaria, and Jesus sends out several of his disciples ahead as messengers to make arrangements for what was probably only an overnight stay at a Samaritan village. Now, Samaria is often sometimes seen as a metaphor as in between times. We live most of our life between Sundays. Sundays are when we, with people of like faith and like belief often, and this is a very comfortable place to be. But the in-between times, the between Sundays, we spend in our own Samaria, in a place that may be even somewhat hostile to some of the things that we believe. Samaria was hostile to Jews. There is an enmity that had grown over history. We don't have time to go into all of this, but there was a great hostility that existed in the relation between Jews and Samaritans. The bottom line is that Jews saw and treated Samaritans as outcasts, as lower than them, people who practiced false religion. And consequently, because of their treatment, they were unwelcome in the towns and were often shunned by Samaritans in return. It's interesting that Luke generally spins a very positive image on Samaritans. The story that you're going to, we'll look at someplace along the way. I think next week that Bill will come talk about it. It was about the Good Samaritan, which was in contrast to where the Jews really thought about him. Well, more often than not, there's a separation between the secular and spiritual lives, because we keep our spiritual life to our Sundays, and the rest of our life is over here, and we live it separately. But God intends those things to overlap. Well, Jesus sends his disciples in. They're not welcome, and they're rejected. And instead of receiving help, they're rejected specifically because they were headed for Jerusalem. Then Luke tells us that John and James, who Jesus had given them the nickname Sons of Thunder. You know, sometimes we think of John as disciple because when you read his gospel account, and he also refers to himself as the one who Jesus loved. When you read his epistles, 1st and 2nd, 3rd John, his letters that he wrote, love is such a big part of those letters. We think, wow, John must have been such a loving kind of person. He was, after he was transformed by Jesus. Because this is an example of what John was like before he experienced God's transformation. This should be really encouraging to any of us who live with somebody, or perhaps are ourselves, of kind of a hard-nosed character. We have anger management issues, all those kinds of things. God can transform you, can transform anyone, because John is transformed. Here, he and his brother James, their response to the rejection is to say, shall we bring down thunder? Let's incinerate them. Let's obliterate them. Sounds like somebody else I know in this world that thinks as soon as somebody protests or rejects him, they should incinerate them, obliterate them. Jesus' response is one that says, no, that's not what I'm all about. We'll leave it the way it is, and we'll simply move on to another. And he rebukes them And the term there that is used for rebuking is one of the sternest, harshest terms that is often used when it talks about Jesus rebuking evil spirits. So he takes a very harsh approach to that kind of response. But Luke then follows up with 3 brief accounts of encounters with what I would call wannabe followers. And there's something significant that each one of these encounters and Jesus' response to them teaches about what it takes to become and to be one of his followers. I think it's something we need to pay close attention to. Notably, Luke says, as they were walking along the road. In other words, they're already on their way. They're on the road. They're on their journey. And a man comes up and he says, I will follow you wherever you go. Sounds like a pretty strong commitment, doesn't it? But the answer Jesus gives probes deeper into his commitment and takes it beyond simply the words he's speaking. It's easy to say, I'm ready to follow you. It's easy to say the words. Jesus points out that there's going to be a lot more to this than what he might think. And so his answer that he gives is this. He says, are you sure? Do you really know and grasp what you're committing yourself to? And then he goes on to say, foxes have their dens and birds have their nests, but the Son of Man has no place to lay his head. Translation, if you're going to follow me, you need to give up your need for, there they are, the 3 S's, safety, security, and stability. It's not that everybody that follows Jesus needs to be homeless. That's not what he's saying here. But if those are your essential priorities in life and they trump every decision you make and they determine whatever decision you make, the reality is you'll find it difficult at best, if not impossible, to become a follower of Jesus, because to follow Jesus is to be ready to be exposed to the unsafe, the insecure, and the unstable. As it has been said before, if these are your top priorities in life, you will probably find it difficult at best to follow, to be fully committed. Following Jesus means taking the road less traveled, as we've seen, and also means giving up, at least at different times, prioritizing these 3 things. So Jesus is saying, you need to be willing to not have a place that you call home. That doesn't mean you don't have to have a place to live, but you need to be willing to give that up. As they go along, they come across another man to whom Jesus invites to follow. He says, follow me. Now, the response of this individual at face value doesn't seem out of hand. He says, Lord, let me go first bury my father. Seems like a valid request, doesn't it? I mean, I would think so. But it's very unlikely that his father, in fact, it's pretty much impossible. His father was dead at that point because he wouldn't be there. The laws in those times is you need to be buried within 24 hours of death. So he would be out there saying, talking to Jesus if that was the case. It's most likely that he's referring to the fact that in their culture, as I believe in our culture and your culture here today, there is an obligation, especially by older children, to be responsible for their aging parents and to not leave their side or abandon them, so to speak, while they still had life left. They were charged with the responsibility of looking after them. Fair enough. So behind this request is probably this cultural norm that says, I can't leave until my responsibilities and my obligations to my parents have been fulfilled. But Jesus' response is one that there are times when following him takes precedence over those obligations. And he says, let the dead bury their own dead, but you go and proclaim the kingdom of God. Sounds harsher than maybe it really was meant to be, but I think what he's saying is there's a sacrifice that we need to be willing to make, although it may not be needed always across the board for all followers of Jesus. My parents, I grew up on a mission field. My parents went out as missionaries to Ecuador. They went back out in the 40s. That was back when travel was more complicated. You didn't fly back and forth. It was very expensive. You didn't even make phone calls back and forth. We had telegrams. We knew, you know what telegrams are? When things were really urgent, we used telegrams. In both their cases, they lost parents who died while they were there, and they were unable to even come back to attend to any kind of funeral or service for them. They knew what it was to say, we will leave that to serve God because he's called us to be in this place. It doesn't mean across the board that we have to then abandon our aging parents. I hope my children don't abandon me. Eventually I'll get to that age, as all of us will, maybe. But there's a point where I would want them to prioritize God's call in their life to be someplace else in the world. I would be so excited if my daughter came to me and said, Dad, we're off to wherever in the world, and we may not see you in a few years. We'll send you a picture of the grandchildren. I'd be so excited for her, because that is what it means to follow Jesus wholeheartedly and be fully committed to it. The third situation comes up when yet another person comes up and tells Jesus, I will follow you, Lord, but first let me go back and say goodbye to my family. Now, once again, it seems like a fair request, does it not? All these seem like really reasonable requests to make. But once again, Jesus cuts to the quick with his response. I think perhaps discerning that there's something that isn't readily apparent in his words. As Jesus says, no one who puts a hand to the plow and looks back is fit for the service in the kingdom of God. It's kind of reference to when you're plowing a field. If you want to plow in a straight line, you have to pick a point on the horizon up and you need to aim for that and just keep going. If you keep turning back to see where you've been, you won't plow a straight line. I think Jesus' response is one that kind of says, I think there's something going on here. Reading in between the lines, it seems that this person is wanting to keep one foot in this world over here, while one foot in the world where he's following Jesus. He wants to be in two camps, so to speak. The reality of following Jesus, and we've talked about this already before, but it bears repeating, it always involves a leaving. A willing to leave a past life behind, regardless of what it was. Doesn't have to be all negative or bad stuff, but leaving behind to move ahead with Jesus. I've moved around a lot in my life. We've pastored in several different churches now. One of the things I've learned is you never fully arrive in the next place until you fully leave the last place. As long as you keep a foot in life back there, and that doesn't mean you cut off contacts. We have friends pretty much in many different places in the world because we've lived in different places. You don't cut off those contacts. But in terms of your own life and your own commitment, you make the transition. You leave that, and this is this new start. You can't make a new start until you leave one thing behind. And I think Jesus is saying, the idea of saying goodbye, going back there, is the sense that you want to hold on to a little bit about that, but you need to leave that behind. The reality of following Jesus is that it involves a leaving without holding on even to the smallest part, perhaps with the thinking that if this doesn't work out, I can always go back to what I was doing before. So 3 individuals, 3 different issues that potentially could keep them from becoming fully devoted followers of Jesus. As we kind of wrap this up, I just want to point out 2 things. First is Jesus not asking from them anything that he doesn't expect from himself. He's fully devoted, fully committed. He's resolutely determined to fulfill his mission. It is with great determination and resolution that he is heading to what awaits him in Jerusalem. Knowing what will follow, the confusion, the chaos, the doubts, the hardships for those who stay loyal to him, he spells out what kind of commitment it will take to follow through with being one of his followers and carrying on his mission once he has physically left this earth. But there's a second thing here that I don't want us to overlook, because this brings it back to how it deals with us. And that is that we're not told ultimately what the final response of any one of these three people is. It's left open-ended. Now, we may be a little bit cynical and assume that they all three turned away, but perhaps not. The story is left open-ended, unresolved, and inconclusive. And this prepares our way for as we go through some of the stories Jesus told, because often in his stories, he brings you to a point and then leaves it unresolved for you to decide if you're in that story, if you were identifying with a particular character in that story, what would your choice be? When he tells the story of what we know as the prodigal son, and he comes back, and there's this party that's going on, and the older son shows up, and he invites the older son to him. We're never told if the older son actually goes in and celebrates with his younger brother or not. We're left to figure out, if we were the older son in those circumstances, would we do that, or would we not? And I think the same thing is taking place here. When Luke tells these accounts and gives these accounts, he's putting it out in front of us some of the very same tests that you and I face when it comes to becoming a fully devoted follower of Jesus. We will all face at least one or more of these tests along the way at different times. And the question is left hanging with us, as it's left hanging with these three individuals. What would you choose? What would you choose? The question that is left open here for each one of us to answer then on our own is, what will your answer be to become a follower of Jesus? Do you have your excuses and your reasons ready to kind of identify why right now isn't the right time? Are you going to put it off for a while? Are you going to say, well, what I'm doing right now is just for this time. It's just for this time. I will get to it later. I will be freer from some of these obligations. I will have life together. My kids will have grown up, and they will be off on their own. They will be in university, whatever. They'll be kind of making life their own. I can follow you and move wherever you call me to go then. Or my aging parents will not be around anymore. I will be free from those obligations. I will follow you. I can work at this job for a little while, make enough money, and then we can live a little bit better when we follow you and do your bidding. Just put it off a little bit longer. That's what all three of these were faced with when they put their excuses and their reasons front. We don't know how they resolved that. And that's because the question comes back to you and me. How would we resolve that issue? How do we answer that situation? If you are being asked today by Jesus, what is your answer to him? Father, thank you. Thank you for the stories that we find told in Scripture that lead us to a point of connecting with what you're doing in the world and your invitation for us to be part of it. May all of us at least dig deep and find that courage and the faith to say, yes, Lord, wherever you lead, whatever you say, I will follow.